For me personally, sound design is probably one of the most important aspects to make a memorable monster or even enemy in a video game. Whether you're talking about the crying of the witch from Left 4 Dead or even just the constant chitter chatter of the grunts from Halo. Often we find ourselves relating memories with sounds and smells, and I feel like this is why sound is such an important part with video games, because well, games don't stink. Unless you're talking about Resident Evil 7 and that candle, that was weird. But when you think of enemies and sounds of enemies, you think of a few games. For example, you think of Silent Hill. You could think of enemies from Silent Hill, or you could even think about the enemies from Gears of War and how they say their own names almost like a Pokemon. Grind. That shit is so cool though. But for me, I usually think about Resident Evil. And Resident Evil 3 and 4 were definitely turning points in the Resident Evil series franchise, where they actually took more of an action focus. But somehow they seem to, out of these two games, make some of the most memorable and creepy enemies of all time. Resident Evil 3 gave you the unstoppable Nemesis, which everyone immediately just says, stars. How can one word just put so much fear into so many players' hearts? And that's because the Nemesis is so unpredictable. He was the first of his kind, just popping out left and right, unstoppable and unaware when he's actually gonna come out. It's such a cool enemy design, but somehow he seems to be one of the most iconic enemies of all time, though only appearing once. And this is probably most noticeable with Resident Evil 4. They changed the camera angle. It's entirely different from any other Resident Evil we've seen before. It now sits on your shoulder. It gives the player more freedom and a better sense of their surroundings and enemy placement. This time you're able to kung fu kick enemies in the head and DDT them on the ground. But even though this is more of an action focused game, they still somehow made one of the most terrifying enemies in Resident Evil history, and maybe in gaming history. Ladies and gentlemen, I present to you the Regenerator. Lightning bursts above your head as your bloodstained boots squelch in the mud. Insane chanting still behind you, etching ever closer despite each frantic stride you take. For a moment you see hope, a cabin, a forgotten sanctuary in the distance, before thunder urges you onward. With shaking hands and your panting breath, you grasp the door handle, throw it back, and use your weight to block it. No, a table would be better. You have to heave it over, hoping it will hold them off at least as long as the storm lingers. Your chest constricts as each breath feels like glass going through your throat. The mixture of the cold and the wet frees you to the bone. But the harsh sounds of the infected fades away as the thunder rolls on, with the lightning only blinding you occasionally. As you stand there panting with only your thoughts to distract your mind, you realise the cabin itself was a festering corpse of a building. A smell you were growing so accustomed to that wretched place, and the darkness itself was suffocating. But after everything you've seen and experienced so far, it was almost comforting to know that you couldn't see what was going on around you. But then suddenly, the sound of a slow dragging came ever closer, and this changed your mind so quickly. Hello? You say breathlessly, hoping to not get a reply. Standing in the dark, questioning your senses in the bowels of madness was the first thing on your mind. But as the shuffling only came closer and the lightning only illuminated something moving ahead, those feelings were very quickly thrown aside. Your shaking hands reached and tried to grab for the gun. The only protection, the only salvation, and the trembling only worsened when you tried to reach for your next new clip. Everything tumbled out of your hands, the clips scattered all across the floor, empty, new. They were everywhere. As you fall to your knees, searching blindly just for one new clip, the sounds of dragging footsteps were then accompanied by a horrid sound of breathing. It was ragged and slow, like it wormed its way into your ear and tunneled itself into your mind. It torments you with one horrifying, terrible truth. You're never making it out alive. As your stiff, cold hands scratch and feel across the dirty ground, your fingers feel what you can only recognise as a new gun clip. You pick it up, but in your shaking fear, you have trouble putting it into your gun. But you do successfully, and you cock the gun backwards. Trying your best to steady your hands and to stop the desperate whimperings that escape your mouth. As your heart begins to beat ever faster, you see the eyes looming in the darkness, watching you, coming closer with every single drag. The beast's pupils are frantically going left to right all around the room, almost aimlessly, but you know it has a target, and it knows you're there. A single tear at this point runs down your filthy face. You realise every single nightmare you've had to endure tonight was only just the start. Whatever this thing was, it was at your face, and the only thing you could do was pull the trigger. I just want to clarify, I understand that you're probably thinking, wait, that's not how you spell Regenerator in the title and thumbnail. That's how it's spelled in the Spanish way. It's actually spelled that way in the game, but it just seems to be a common misconception that everyone spells it as Regenerator, but even though it's Regenerator, but we pronounce it Regenerator because, you know, I'm not Spanish. This thing was a mean left hook. You never saw it coming. I mean, this thing changed the pace of the game entirely. You may be looking at this thinking it isn't that bad these days compared to other games that's come out since Resident Evil 4, but think about playing Resident Evil 4 when it first was released. This enemy and monster haunts people's minds. It even haunts people to this day when they think about the most horrible sounds in horror history. A lot of people will probably bring up that disturbing sound of breathing. I don't know what it is. I don't know why they sound so gross, but just that constant, it's enough to put you off, and it's enough to put you on edge. And something I like about this breathing, it's so subtle and calm compared to the rest of the game. Most of the game takes place with enemies shouting at you, shooting at you, wanting to chop away and chase you down with pitchforks, but then you get this breathing which is almost comparable to the sound of a bulldog being out of breath. And trust me, I've had a few bulldogs in my time. It sounds like it's constantly struggling to even get a breath, maybe with the lack of its nose and the constant wide and open jaw. Obviously this explains why it sounds the way it does. And instead of being charged by groups, you're slowly being stalked, just an enemy that just drags its feet across the floor just to get to you. This slow pace, the twitching and squirming of its figure, it's off-putting, it's intimidating, it's really a slow change of pace, and these enemies could so easily fit into games like Silent Hill and even early days of Resident Evil because how eerie and how creepy they really are. Unloading shots into an enemy that can only heal itself is really enough to put any survival horror fan into a strange panic. You can shoot the leeches that fester within its body with a thermal visual scope, but if you aren't prepared to take out this thing, I can promise you're going to get put into an uncomfortable corner. You can actually blow its limbs away to slow it down and watch it wiggle across the floor, but I mean that's not saying much anyway because it would just get back up as soon as it's ready to regenerate. It's things like this which make the Regenerator for me maybe one of my most favourite Resident Evil mutant enemies of all time. It's not overused, to the stage it actually only appears in one game. It's got a strange messed up lore behind it, and if you really want to look into it, you really understand the tortured souls behind these experiments, to the stage that you can actually see the evolution of this thing being made, and that's something that you don't get to see very often with memorable characters. It's these small touches that really make the Regenerator stick out because the build up is so perfect here. I think it's way more intimidating than Dead Space Regenerator, and even though it may be way slower and actually killable, it just has a looming presence unlike anything I've ever seen before. It has a different sense of presence. You can't really compare it to Mr. X of Resident Evil 2, who's always so aggressive and on your case, but this time you sort of compare it more to the likes of Lisa from PT or even Alma from the Fear franchise. An enemy that has almost a story behind it, that has something to it which makes you so interested to learn more about it, but also has such a signature sense about it. The sounds that they all make, the presence that it just leaves behind, that ever-looming fear that you know you're eventually going to have to face it later on in the game. It's such a creepy and really cool effect to have on an enemy. It's something that I feel like Resident Evil actually quite failed at. They wanted to sort of have that same sort of enemy design with the molded, with you seeing the evolution of the molded, and even them actually resembling the Regenerator in some sort of sense with the wide teeth and the way that they only walk around. I do like the idea of the molded, but I don't think they had the same effect, and I think that's because they were used way too often and actually just come across a little bit more goofy and stupid. There are tons of videos on the Regenerator and I find that super interesting. How does a single enemy leave such a big impact on people and even on players? How does it send a shiver down the audience's spine and just become a permanent part of a franchise even though it appears only once and even just for a quarter of the runtime of the actual game? That for me is why the Regenerator is really worth talking about, and it's definitely something worth fearing, especially in video games. I hope you guys actually like this new sort of thing I was trying to go for, especially with the storybook idea. I want to lean more into that. If you want to see more of that, obviously let me know, but I actually want to experiment more with that because I quite like doing that. I quite like directing a scene but with my ears. I think that's quite a fun take to do it. Anyway, thank you so much for watching this video. I really do hope you enjoyed. I hope you have a great evening or great day, whatever time it is for you. And of course, I'll see you at the next checkpoints.